welcome everybody to today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Griffith and I work at NUMOA, which is the Northeast Waste Management Officials Association. And you should be seeing my screen with our NUMOA website. Dr. Perez, is that what you see, the NUMOA website?
I do.
Good, great. So NUMOA's website is very old, but it's still very functional. And part of the reason why I'm showing this is because, one, so you can get a little better sense of what NUMOA is. We're the Northeast Waste Management Officials Association. The 6 New England states, New York and New Jersey, work together on different waste-related issues, including the waste site cleanup programs. The waste site cleanup programs, one of the main priorities is for NUMOA to help with training and information sharing. And so that's what we're doing today. PFAS has been a topic at NUMOA since 2016. And this webinar series, this is the first webinar in an 11 webinar series. Most of you probably saw an email about that. But I'm also going to show you where you can find out more information. And I'm also going to show you this because this is where you'll be able to find the presentations after today's webinar. They'll get posted on the NUMOA website. So, so here's our main website, numoa.org. Then you pick over here on the left side, waste site cleanup. And then you get here and there's events. So it goes from the thing that's furthest in the future to the thing that's closest. So we've got a couple of conferences that were supposed to be in 2020 that are now in 2022. But then we've got all these webinars. So here's these 11 webinars. So you'll just scroll down. This is what's coming up. And then eventually you get to past webinars. So today's webinar will turn into a past webinar. And that's where you'll be able to click on it and have the presentations from today's webinar will be posted. So this is a great resource. NUMOA has done a lot of webinars. And when we could, we also held in-person events. Workshops, so there is a wealth of information here. We've done lots of webinars on PFAS. We had a bunch this past summer, and we've also done other waste site cleanup topics, PCBs and building products, vapor intrusion. We had some. So if you work in waste site cleanup, you can find some other information here as well. But we've got a great archive of information. The workshops have the presentations that were in the workshop as well. So we've got lots of great information for you on the NUMOA website. And here's today's webinar. So with that, we have a lot of people joining us today, which is great. We welcome everybody, including our colleagues up in Ontario, Canada, and Hawaii and Alaska. Because there's so many people, we will not be able to do questions and answers live. So you can type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. There's a questions section, and you can just type in a question. You can type questions in at any point. You don't have to wait till the end of the presentation. And then I will be monitoring those questions, and then I will ask the questions of the presenters when the time comes. So we've got 2 great presentations today. This is our first webinar in the series. We thought we'd start with health effects and with PFAS. And so our first presenter, Dr. Perez, is going to give us sort of an overview and an up-to-date status of what we know about human health effects of PFAS. And then our second presentation will go into a little bit deeper dive with Dr. Messelian, who will talk more about immune effects and children. So with that, I'm going to introduce our first presenter. Again, for people that just joined, the presentations will be posted after the webinar. It takes a few days. I can't do them myself anymore, so someone else has to do them. It takes a little while. So, but hopefully by the end of the week, they'll be posted, and I will send everybody an email when that happens. So let's see. turn the controls over to Dr. Perez. So Dr. Angela Perez is a senior toxicologist for the Center for Toxicology and Environmental Health, which is known mostly as CTEH, which is an emergency response and disaster recovery firm. Dr. Perez is currently up in Canada doing COVID emergency response work. But she earned her doctorate in toxicology from Oregon State University and conducted postdoctoral work at the University of California, San Francisco. She's got over 15 years of experience in the field of toxicology, chemical exposure assessment, and human health risk assessment. Her focus of her research and field experience includes evaluation of exposures and potential health risks of metals, asbestos, cannabis compounds, and associated additives. But today's topic, and perfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS, per and poly. So Dr. Perez is based out of Portland, Oregon. So with that, take it away.
Thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate the kind introduction. My name is Angie Perez. Please, if you have questions at any time, feel free to post in the chat, or you can email me at aperez@cteh.com. I'm going to give a high-level state of the science overview of some of the primary health effect endpoints that have been proposed for exposure to PFAS chemicals. All right, okay, so since as the first speaker, I feel obliged to present a overview slide of polyfluoral and perfluoroalkyl substances. These are a very large chemical class comprised of over 5,000 different unique chemicals. They are marked by a carbon-fluorine bond, which is very, very strong, one of the strongest known in nature. And they're categorized by the number of carbon side chains. They are regulatorily differentiated as short and long chain chemicals, where C8 with a carbon 8 backbone are generally referred to as long chain, and less than C8 are generally referred to as short chain. And this carbon-fluorine bond is perhaps the most notable reason for their environmental persistence. Some of the applications of PFAS include well-known applications such as nonstick applications on cookware, waterproofing for clothing, soil stain, oil-resistant properties for furniture and carpet. They're also used in medical devices, in food packaging, and then, of course, on upholstery, carpet, and clothing. So in the field of toxicology and pharmacology, the kinetics of how a chemical enters and is processed in the human body is generally described using an acronym, ADME, which stands for absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. And the primary route of exposure for PFAS is through oral intake. And we know that wherein, at least for PFOA and PFAS, they are readily absorbed through the gastrointestinal tract. We also call this complete absorption. PFAS chemicals bind to proteins and not lipids, which distinguish them from other legacy chemicals. And they're predominantly distributed in the serum and the liver. And we know this through some autopsy studies, wherein they have shown that distribution of distinct PFAS are found in the kidney, the spleen, the testes, the brain, and in some cases in the lung tissue. One distinction that was also made in some of the animal studies is that the longer the fluoroalkyl chain, the more of the compound accumulates in the liver. With respect to metabolism of PFAS compounds, there's minimal metabolism, at least for PFOA or PFAS, and that's likely due to the strength of that carbon-fluorine bond. So neither PFOA or PFAS are metabolized to any significant extent in the human body, and research is ongoing for insight into the potential metabolism of some of the shorter chain substitution chemicals. In animal models, there is some evidence that precursor chemicals to PFAS, such as the fluorotelomeres and the derivatives, can be biotransformed into PFAS in the human body. There are numerous potential sources of PFAS exposure in our daily lives, so it's notable that it would be very difficult to attribute a point source or differentiate between what is existing PFAS chemical and what is new PFAS chemical in the human body without using tracer chemicals. There are also notable differences in the metabolic processes of humans versus those in rodents. And those differences may have a pretty significant impact on the development of the toxicity values. In one study, elevated concentrations of perfluorohexoethanoic acid, which is a metabolite of a 6,2-fluorotelomere alcohol, was seen in human organs, but not in rodents. And this was surprising because it basically suggested that the metabolism of PFAS in humans must be different from the metabolism in rodents. This has also been seen in a few other studies, some early ones by Hogan in 1981, where he looked at 8,2-fluorotelomere alcohols and found PFOA in rats, and then also in some perfluoropentanoic acids. These differences in the metabolic processes need to be taken into consideration in relation to risk assessment based on studies in rats where other metabolites may dominate. Excretion of PFAS is generally couched in terms of what we call a half-life. And a half-life of a chemical is the amount of time it takes to reduce the chemical concentration in the body by half. And half-lives can be tissue or organ specific. So in humans, renal clearance of PFOA is almost negligible in both sexes, while PFAS is slowly excreted mainly in urine and to a lesser extent in the feces. And we're seeing in this table shown below some various half-lives that have been proposed for PFAS chemicals. And what we notice is that for the C8 chains for PFAS and PFOA, they generally range from, for PFAS, range from 5 to 8 years, and for PFOA from 2 to 4 years. And there have been some observations made that half-lives of PFAS in blood are generally longer for the sulfonates than for the carboxylates. So, for example, PFAS has a longer half-life, a sulfonate has a longer half-life than PFOA, which is a carboxylate. And they tend to increase with the chain length for carboxylates in animal models. This is an important distinction. So half-lives are also shorter for the branched isomers. Of note, rodent half-lives are very short for PFAS, on the order of hours to days. And this is largely due to elimination in the rat is more rapid, and it's because they largely utilize active renal excretion. One other thing that is notable is that in general, for rodents, we expect to see the longer the carbon chain, the longer the half-life. But if you look at the perfluorohexane sulfonate, you'll notice that it actually has a longer reported half-life, or estimated half-life, than PFAS, which is a C8 or long-chain PFAS chemical. And so I think there is still further work that has to be done to elucidate some of those half-life chemicals, especially with some of the substitution PFAS chemicals. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about health effects of PFAS, and I'm going to cover the first 4 topics here: cancer, liver toxicity / liver metabolism or modulation, reproductive or developmental impacts, and endocrine modulation. I will not be discussing immunotoxicity because Dr. Meserian or Carmen and Vincente are going to talk about that in great detail in our next presentation. So let's start talking about the health effects, the chief among them being cancer. So the primary health effects that are being actively investigated related to PFAS exposure include these 5 endpoints, and I will briefly cover the state of the science for each of these toxicity endpoints. So for cancer, the US EPA reports suggestive evidence that PFOA and PFAS may cause liver, testicular, and pancreatic cancers, and this is based on animal data. Typically, the first wave of developing toxicity criteria is fairly conservative, and that of PFOA is no exception. So for example, EPA's dose that is assumed to be protective for possible PFOA-related cancer of approximately 0.58 mg per kg per day is nearly 30,000 times greater than their proposed RFD for PFOA. However, the EPA also reports a PFOA drinking water concentration of 0.5 microgram per liter that may result in a 1 in a million increased risk of cancer. So there's still to be some work on the toxicity endpoints, even of some of the better known PFAS chemicals such as PFOA. The cancer endpoints that were used to derive the oral RFD were based on 2 rodent studies. And in one rodent study, PFOA was found to be, quote, weakly tumorigenic at the highest dose of 300 ppm or 15 mg per kg per day. That's a study by Butenhoff et al. 2012, and another by Beigel et al. 2001. And the proposed mechanism of carcinogenicity in rats was the combined activation of the xenoreceptors, the xenosensor nuclear receptors. So there's a few of them listed here. PPAR alpha is one that comes up in a lot of different studies, but also to a lesser extent CAR and PXR. One important distinction about this proposed mechanism is that there are differences between animal models and humans. And because of these differences, in addition to the weak experimental and epidemiological data, there are doubts as to the carcinogenic potential of PFAS. And in a recent study by Butenhoff in 2014 and Lau in 2017, it was noted that for genotoxicity, at least, perfluoroalkyls do not possess the chemical physical properties typically associated with directly genotoxic agents, and in general have not been found to be genotoxic in the various screening assays used to detect point mutations and chromosomal aberrations. To continue on that same thread, the human PFOA cancer link is not well supported by other studies. So in a study by Chang et al. In 2014, they evaluated the results from 2 of the occupational cohorts in Minnesota being the 3M cohort and the West Virginia being the DuPont cohort, and found that they did not support an increased risk of kidney and testicular cancers. So even though, for example, the EPA has estimated a slope factor for PFOA, the risk-specific dose at 1 in a million is less than the proposed RFD. And this is likely due to the fact that the slope factor that the EPA derived is based on animal data and is not based on human epidemiology data. And as such, by definition, in deriving a toxicity value, there is insufficient data to support a slope factor calculation, let alone to show causation. So in this 2014 article, these authors applied what's called the Bradford-Hill criteria. It's otherwise known as the Hill's criteria for causation, to provide evidence of a causal relationship between a punitive cause and an effect. And so what Chang and colleagues found was that the evidence of association between this kidney and testicular cancers and PFOA did not meet hardly any of the Hill criteria and are likely due to chance, confounding, and are biased. And I'm happy to answer any other questions about the Hill criteria if you want, but they are listed here. All right, so let's move on to investigation or overview of liver toxicity and or lipid metabolism or modulation and lipid metabolism. So typically, for liver toxicity or liver lipid metabolism, we're looking at potential activation of nuclear receptors and or alteration, which in turn result in alteration of lipid metabolism. So if we consider one of the primary endpoints for liver effects and or lipid metabolism modulation, the endpoint that has been hypothesized is that that of the PFAS exposure and its association with increased serum cholesterol levels in humans. So in recent studies, it's been hypothesized that populations exposed via drinking water to PFAS show increased serum cholesterol concentrations, and that this may ultimately lead to increased risk of cardiovascular disease. There are several mechanisms as to why exposure to PFAS may result in liver toxicity or modulation of liver enzymes. And chief among them is the finding that PFAS are potential activators of receptors that regulate lipid metabolism, both in humans and in animals. And this has been shown by experimental data. In rats, perfluorocarboxylic acids induce peroxisome proliferation, which has resulted in liver cell hypertrophy and increased liver weight. So there's a toxicity endpoint in rats. In human epidemiological studies, there have been positive associations between PFOA exposure and increased liver enzymes, such as, here's that liver enzyme again, PPAR alpha, and also this liver fatty acid binding protein, the LFABP. Those also have been reported. Interestingly, there may be some moiety-specific activation of liver enzymes, wherein PPAR alpha activity is higher in response to carboxylates, such as PFOA, compared to sulfonates, such as PFAS. And I think there's further research to be done to explore that binding capacity and binding affinity. However, the general activity level of binding has been proposed as follows, whereas the shorter chain, the PFBS, the butane sulfonate, is less than PFAS, is less than the perfluorohexane sulfonate, is less than the butane, the butanoic acid, and so on. You can see that here. So in considering the summary, so this is our longest section of the group, in considering the evidence either supporting or refuting PFAS exposure and an association with increased cholesterol, we have to weigh evidence supporting and evidence refuting. So starting with the evidence supporting, in general, PFAS do activate lipid metabolism receptors in humans and in animals. And there have been positive associations between PFAS exposure and increased cholesterol and triglycerides in rodents. And there's also some epidemiological evidence, albeit limited, suggesting a similar effect amongst PFAS-exposed humans, wherein they have increased cholesterol and triglycerides, and they have activation of lipid metabolism receptors. So in considering the evidence refuting PFAS exposure and increased cholesterol, similarly, we have an evaluation here. The elimination time for PFAS and PFAS in humans is substantially longer than in rodents. So we talked about in the previous slide, rodent elimination is on the orders of days to weeks, whereas human, it's in the orders of years. These elimination time differences result in a longer duration to reach a steady state dose, which of course will have an impact on the determination of any type of a dose response relationship. Also, PPAR alpha is expressed in human liver tissue at about 10% that of rodent levels. And this is important because humans and other primates have been shown to be less responsive to PPAR alpha agonists compared with rodents. We also find, unfortunately, that epidemiological studies are inconsistent and are limited by some pretty serious quality issues. For example, my colleagues and I are conducting a study now where we've binned all available epidemiology studies into occupational PFAS exposures and community-based PFAS exposures. And what we see is a far greater positive association in community-based exposures than in occupational exposures. And this doesn't really make sense from a perspective of a dose response, because of course we would assume that occupational exposures would have a far higher dose than community-based exposures. This also assuming that there's a linear dose response model in play here. It was even acknowledged that way back in 2010 by this, as part of the C8 panel discussion, that quote, by Frisbee et al. In 2010, by quote, evidence from animal studies has suggested that activation of PPAR alpha is an important mechanism through which PFOA and PFAS exert biological effects, although it is unclear whether this animal-based evidence can be extrapolated to humans, and that's from page 866. All right, I want to talk a little bit about reproductive or developmental health effects of PFAS. And we'll start by introducing that the evidence for reproductive and or developmental effects is primarily limited to PFAS and PFOA. So PFAS and PFOA can cause reproductive and developmental effects in rodents, and these effects include total litter loss and reduced pup weight at high doses. The mechanism of reproductive and or developmental effects is unclear, and perhaps my co-presenter, Carmen, can help elucidate, or Vincente can help elucidate any new findings related to mechanism of developmental effects. The mechanism is seemingly not related to decreased lipids, glucose utilization, or modulation of thyroid hormones, but we do see some of the similar upregulations of xenoreceptors, such as androsterone and pregnane X in pups. However, to complicate matters still, the potential PFAS impact on neurodevelopment as opposed to is not the same as for survival and growth outcomes. And that has led to the hypothesis that it is unlikely that there is one shared mechanism by which all PFAS produce their potential adverse effects. In humans, the placenta shares biological features, including some transporter proteins, with PFAS target organs in the kidney and liver. And we know from recent studies that, certain PFAS pass readily from mother to the developing fetus. So the hypothesized health outcome of maternal PFAS exposure include an association with hypertensive pregnancies and preeclampsia in humans, though the mechanism is unclear. All right. So I'm specifically going to cover thyroid hormone modulation associated with exposure to PFAS in this section. There are other endocrine modulation endpoints, but thyroid hormone is the best studied among these. Okay. So certain PFAS have been shown to competitively bind to the thyroid hormone plasma transporter protein, so TTR, which can result in a decrease of free thyroxine, or T4, in the blood, and that's in animals. Of note, the binding potency of fluorinated chemicals that were studied by Weiss et al. 2009 was anywhere from 12 to 300 times lower than that of thyroxine itself. And so there is a proposed binding potency rank order for various PFAS, and it's shown below, wherein the C6 compound, fluorohexane sulfonate, is greater than that, binding affinity is greater than that of PFOA and PFAS, which is in turn greater than that of the hexanoic acid, which is in turn greater than that of the C4, perfluorobutane sulfonate. And also of note, the perfluorobutanoic acid, which is C4, and the fluorotelomere alcohols had no competitive binding effect. So humans are expected to be less sensitive to T4 modulation. And the reason is that humans have very different specificity for serum carrier proteins for T4 than rats. And this biological difference between humans and rodents is critically important and needs to be considered when determining toxicity values, such as the reference dose that was reported this month for perfluorobutane sulfonate. So if you are all familiar, if you've all read the EPA proposed reference dose that came out, if you don't have it, I'm happy to send it to you. But it's based on total serum T4 hormone in newborn mice, and is not based on that of humans. So I think it's important to consider these important differences between human and animal models when developing these toxicity values. All right, I'm going to spend a little time talking about perceived versus actual risk. I think that Jennifer has planned an entire webinar based on risk assessment of PFAS chemicals. If not, I really hope she does, because we could spend a whole day on the topic. And it'd be great to brainstorm with folks. I know there are several new papers out there looking at risk assessment of PFAS chemicals, but in general, I've given this schematic here of what things to consider when determining perceived versus actual risk. So PFAS are toxic to rodents at high concentration, and therefore the next jump, the logical jump, is that therefore PFAS are toxic to me. Also, any detection in the environment equals exposure to me. We see that all the time in risk assessment, and that every exposure is toxic. So these are some of the questions that have to be considered when you are conducting a risk assessment of PFAS chemicals. And there is a process, a very streamlined, delineated process by which you evaluate risk of a chemical. And while it's still being developed, and in the absence of toxicity values for a lot of these PFAS chemicals, it is important to follow these guidelines and best practices for risk assessment. And one example of that is that not all tox profiles are equal for PFAS chemicals. So for example, if we look at reproductive developmental effects, these are no observed adverse effect levels, or NOELs, for PFOA, and then for the C8, and then for perfluorohexanoic acid, which is C6 chemical. You notice there's about an order of magnitude difference between the two chemicals. And this same trend continues down for 2-year chronic toxicity and carcinogenicity. So the takeaway from this is that these need to be on a chemical by chemical basis for, starting with the predominant chemicals used in industry and commerce. So some takeaway messages from this presentation is that PFAS are completely absorbed orally and by inhalation. They're not necessarily absorbed and have not been shown to be dermally absorbed. PFAS are not metabolized in the human body, and some precursor chemicals, such as the fluorotelomeres and the derivatives, are potentially biotransformed inside the human body into PFAS, although more research is needed for this to demonstrate this. There are relatively high concentrations of short and long chain PFAS that have been measured in human tissues, specifically in the lung, the liver, the kidney, the spleen, and to some extent the testes. PFAS are a broad class of chemicals, and the proposed toxicity factors for PFAS vary widely. Thus, not all PFAS are equally toxic and should be addressed on a chemical-specific basis. Also, liver toxicity, thyroid hormone modulation, and reproductive and developmental effects of PFAS have been documented in animals, but have not been well demonstrated and are well studied in humans. And lastly, most of the epidemiology studies are cross-sectional, which means that a causal relationship cannot be evaluated. The association between PFOA and increased cholesterol in humans contradict the results from animal studies. which generally suggests that PFOA exposure in humans decreases cholesterol. So there's definitely either quality issues with some of the epidemiology studies, and this needs to be explored further. The evidence for PFAS exposure and the increased risk of cardiovascular disease does not meet internationally accepted causation criteria. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I welcome any questions or comments after Dr. Mestelian is completed her presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Perez. Actually, we will do some questions now for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll switch over for presentation. So thank you so much. We definitely have some questions, and I don't understand all of them, but so how critical is accounting for internal versus external doses? For example, EPA's cancer slope factor was based on external doses, but the non-cancer value uses a dosimetric adjustment factor.
So I think it was a good question. I think that the derivation of that cancer slope factor, I think it actually needs to be redone. I think that it was based on the best available knowledge, but as you know, for PFAS, at least for PFAS publications, this is an area where there's about 10,000 new publications every year that come into the peer-reviewed literature. So I think they have a very big job ahead of them to evaluate all of this new data to consider a recalculation, including internal, external dose.
Okay. Let's see. Please comment on OEHA, I think that's California, cancer slope factor of 143 versus EPA 0.07 for PFOA.
I'm not familiar with OEHA's calculation. If anyone else on the call is, I welcome any input.
Yeah, so, well, someone could type it in. I don't think we want to get into unmuting people. Let's see. It sounds like rodent studies are not very transferable to human effects and therefore not particularly helpful, but what efforts are underway to, I guess, not use animals in studies? I don't know.
Yeah, so I think one of the big, the gathering of data, so there is important, and looking at association. So everyone is familiar, hopefully, with the NHANES database. I know that there's been a lot of investigation into certain specific PFAS chemicals in NHANES. There also is the CCMR3, and I think in the CCMR7, I think is the next one. The proposal is to add several new PFAS chemicals again to the CCMR. And CCMR, if you're not familiar, is wherein public water systems that serve greater than 10,000 people are evaluated and tested for PFAS chemicals. And so they compare basically those detections of PFAS chemicals with the lifetime health advisory values of like I think it's 40 parts per trillion individually for PFOA, PFAS, and then 70 ppt combined for the sum of those two chemicals. I think in CCMR3 there were 6 PFAS chemicals that were included, and I think in the CCMR7 I think there's proposed to be like 16. So I think the gathering of data and potential exposure data and then looking at potential health effects data is going to be critically important, because where we're really missing is those human epidemiological studies.
Okay. Are you aware of any ongoing research about PFAS affecting the brain and being linked to dementia and Alzheimer's?
I'm not aware of any research. I know that it's found in the brain, it's found in brain tissues, but I'm not aware of any particular research looking at Alzheimer's or dementia.
Okay. Here's another one. Why use the word proposed relative to the half-lives? That was sort of at the beginning of your talk. What is known about half-lives versus not known, I guess?
Oh, okay. I only use the word proposed just because there are various publications that report sometimes wildly different half-lives. And so I could have used the word estimated half-lives. So it's just, there was nothing more to it than the fact that there are various reported half-lives. And then also for, as a second distinction, some of the substitution chemicals, particularly the C6s, the C6 backbones, there aren't that many proposed half-lives or estimated half-lives that have been reported.
Okay, let's see. We take a couple more here. So a couple people did comment about the California study and that it's based on cancer potency factor was based on the NTP 2020 bioassay in rats and was had high rate of pancreatic cancers. Let's see, if the current epidemiological studies show that associations are weak according to the Bradford-Hill criteria, what makes occupational studies satisfactory when they show negative results?
I don't think that they are any better or worse, but you know, the dose response is one of the primary tenets of toxicology and evaluation of in the risk assessment process, right? So the dose response is part of the risk assessment process. And so the assumption that you can better evaluate and potentially assess what is a dose in an occupational environment, it would lend itself to the conclusion that you can, one, you would hypothesize that you would see higher doses in an occupational environment. Two, that you could better evaluate and control what those doses are, assuming that people are receiving a similar dose day in, day out over a year, for example, versus in community-based exposures, where you have drinking water as one of the, what's thought to be one of the primary, not primary, but one of the modes of exposure. And then in addition to all of these other variables, because, you know, we have PFAS in products within our everyday lives. They're all around us, and they're nearly ubiquitous in the environment now. So we find them in the blood of 99% of all humans on Earth. So I think that it's harder to control where those exposures may come from. And it's also thought to be less of a dose potentially than for occupational exposures. So it's not to say that those studies are better, that it's just that they may have better controls with respect to the dose response.
Okay. I think we'll do one more question, which applies to me as well. So for the lay people out there, on slide 16, you talked about upregulations of xenoreceptors. What does that mean?
Yeah, so there are receptors in our body that evidently they see chemicals that are foreign, so xeno meaning foreign to the body. And so these receptors, when they see foreign substances, you can see an upregulation, meaning that they kick into gear to start to bind or scavenge whatever this foreign entity is that's entering your body. And so one way that you can look at it, first you determine whether or not this particular xenoreceptor can bind PFAS, which they have been shown to. And then you look at you take that back a step and look at it in the entire model organism, where you expose the organism to a PFAS chemical, and then look at the potential upregulation of those xenoreceptors. And what we do is what we see is in fact an upregulation of xenoreceptors following exposure to certain PFAS chemicals.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Perez, and she'll be on the webinar at the end where we can do some more question and answer, but I think we'll move on now to our next presenter, and there's definitely more questions that people typed in that we weren't able to get to, so hopefully we'll be able to do that towards the end. So again, you can type in questions at any point. Vicente, you have to accept the, there we go, you see your screen. Start the slideshow. So next we have two presenters. So one is Dr. Vicente Mustelis. Sorry for botching that. I did practice it earlier, but I didn't remember it. Anyway, he is a colleague of Dr. Messerlian's. He is based at the University of Granada in Spain, and his research comes directly from the endocrine disruption field, and his ultimate goal is achieving better understanding of how low-dose complex mixtures of endocrine disrupting chemicals may impact human health throughout their lifespan, and how the available toxicological and observational knowledge can be combined to protect public health. And he did his doctoral studies with Dr. Messerlian and collaborates with her regularly now. So he is on the webinar and available to answer questions as well. And then our primary presenter is Dr. Carmen Messerlian, who is a passionate and curious scientist committed to understanding how the world around us impacts human reproductive health and development. So her research at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health is focused on examining the extent to which environmental exposures affect a couple's ability to achieve conception, maintain pregnancy, and deliver healthy offspring. She applies cutting-edge epidemiological methods to generate evidence-based knowledge of the effects of environmental chemicals on fertility, pregnancy, and child health outcomes. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Nursing and a PhD in Epidemiology from McGill University, and a Master's of Science in Public Health from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So with that, we'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can everybody hear me? It's clear?
Yes.
Good. So thank you very much for that introduction. I'm going to remind myself to cut down my small biography. My short biography should be shorter, but thank you for the very gracious introduction. I want to just again mention my colleague Vicente Mustelis, who's online, and due to personal reasons, he was the one who prepared these presentation slides on my behalf and was made available as a backup in case I wasn't able to do the presentation. But I find myself now able to be present for this talk, and I'm very excited to share this presentation with Vicente, and I want to give him a lot of credit for his effort and contribution as well as his scientific knowledge on this topic. So we do not have any conflicts of interest to declare for this work. Briefly, our plan is to talk to you a little bit about a background, go through PFAS and immune function. Thank you, Angela, for doing such a great job going through the other important relevant endpoints with respect to PFAS exposure. We will then present some information on recent results that we have prepared for looking at perfluorinated substances and common cold using NHANES data, looking at children and adolescents. And then we will conclude with some basic interpretation of the findings, some conclusions, some limitations and strengths of our work and future directions. So I think my introduction was very nice, but if anybody's interested in more information about our work, our SEED program, I'm the PI of that program. We have a robust team, and we're always interested in hearing from you if you have any questions or want to do any follow-ups. So please find us online. So with that, I'd like to introduce, although Angela did an amazing job covering the general aspects of PFAS substances, but I want to also say that per and polyfluoroalkyl substances are environmental toxicants of urgent scientific, governmental, and public health concern. over their near universal human exposure and adverse health effects. And despite decades of research, the consequences of PFAS exposure for human health remain strikingly unclear. PFAS, as we know, are a family of high production volume synthetic water and stain resistant chemicals used in countless consumer products, including nonstick cookware, textiles, and food packaging. PFAS can be found in the water we drink, the food we eat, the air we breathe, and in our homes, schools, and workplaces. The chemical properties that make PFAS useful in so many applications also cause their persistence in the environment and accumulation in the body, with half-lives, as Angela mentioned, between 2 and 8 years. Indeed, PFAS have been labeled quote unquote forever chemicals. And the general population exposure is really ubiquitous. PFAS such as perfluorooctanoic acid or PFOA or perfluorooctane sulfonate, PFAS, are detectable in the serum of more than 99% of the United States population, human population. Again, thank you, Dr. Perez, for doing that introduction. PFAS have also been measured in human amniotic fluid and cord and neonatal blood. And although the two most widely studied PFAS, PFOA and PFAS, were voluntarily phased out by the manufacturers in the early 2000s, human exposure remains prevalent due to widespread environmental contamination. And there's also growing concern regarding the dozens of newer PFAS used as substitutes for PFOA and PFAS, for which research is really lacking. Okay, so we know that exposure pathways of PFAS include dietary ingestion, house dust ingestion, indoor air inhalation, and possibly dermal absorption. Ingestion is really, or ingestion of contaminated food and drinks is the dominant pathway for PFAS in the general population. And the major sources of PFAS in human blood are seafood consumption for PFOA, PFAS, and PFNA, and consumer products such as carpet and nonstick pans for PFHXS. Drinking water may actually contribute up to 20% of exposure levels, although this is highly dependent on the geographical location for which a person lives. Although direct exposure of PFAS from consumer products can be reduced through shifts in production, exposure is really driven by contamination in the groundwater from firefighting foams and accumulation in the food chain, which can persist over a long period of time. Similarly, transplacental and breastfeeding passage of accumulated PFAS concentrations in mothers is really inevitable. Therefore, strict national and international regulations are needed to stop the vicious cycle of exposure to these persistent chemicals. So, what about children? Children, we know, have a higher burden of PFAS exposure and has been demonstrated to occur among young children. And elevated serum concentrations of PFAS versus adults have been demonstrated. And this is really thought to be due to mouthing behaviors, time spent on the floor closer to dust sources for children, different body size to surface area and intake ratios across ages, as well as through exposure through placental transfer or breastfeeding. Neonates and breastfed toddlers are probably the population group exposed to the highest concentrations of these chemicals. And this particular group in the population is considered a very highly vulnerable group that's susceptible to adverse effects. Most importantly, with respect to this presentation, is that early childhood is a critical window for immune system maturation, and including endpoints to the immune system. We do know that the immune system gradually matures during infancy, and early protection is provided by the mother through passive IgG antibody transferred transplacentally through pregnancy, as well as through breast milk. Then, as the young children mature, they obtain or have direct exposure to infections, and that helps them to develop their innate and adaptive immune systems. And that's when we see the maturation of the immune system in early infancy and childhood. And the accumulation of immunological memory is an evolving feature of the adaptive immune response. And as a result, young adults can suffer fewer infections. And so due to this maturation of the immune system, as we mature in age into adolescence and young adults, our immune system strengthens and we have less susceptibility to infections. And this memory persists into old age, but then may fade or decline with time and with aging. And alterations and deviations during this training period or this maturation period that occurs in infancy and childhood may actually have long-term consequences that predisposes an individual to future infections, autoimmune diseases, or even an increased risk of cancer. So moving on, that was the basic introduction. Moving on now to some of the experimental evidence of immunosuppression for PFAS compounds. So with this regard, we know that there's numerous experimental studies that have evaluated the immunotoxicity of PFAS in rodents and zebrafish. And most of these studies have really focused on PFOA and PFAS. Some long-chain PFAS can alter immune status in rodents. The observed effects are predominantly immunosuppressive, including decreased spleen and thymus weight, reduction in the number of circulating immune cells, reduced specific antibody production, and altered cytokine production. However, the exact mechanisms are not elucidated to date. We do know that PFAS compounds have an affinity for, as Angela had mentioned, for PPAR receptors, which exert important functions in inflammation and immune response. The expected mode of action of PFAS involves nuclear factor kappa B cell signaling and the upregulation of apoptotic genes in lymphoid organs such as the thymus and the spleen. Really importantly, in 2020, the European Food Safety Authority, known as EFSA, selected immunotoxicity as the most critical health endpoint for risk assessment based on both animal and human evidence. And you could find the reference for this EFSA report on this slide, and these slides will be shared with you. In the next slide, you can see this is table 20 of the recent EFSA report, in which it can be appreciated that most information available to us with respect to immune function, as well as other endpoints, really focus on PFAS and PFOA. In most studies, a reduction in the immune endpoint investigated is observed at different doses. Regarding limitations of animal models, however, there are relevant toxicokinetic differences. Thus, there are substantial differences in PFAS elimination rates between humans, monkeys, and rodents, with longer half-lives found in humans for most PFAS. Although these differences may be accounted for in risk assessment, the need for more human studies is urgent. Vicente, I realized I wasn't telling you to switch slides, but you can switch slides. You've been doing a great job. I'm sorry for not prompting you. Okay, so next. So what do we know about the epidemiological evidence? So that was a summary of the experimental evidence. The most robust epidemiologic evidence has been focused on the association between PFAS, certain PFAS, and reduced antibody levels. And this reduction in antibody levels may not only mean a decreased protection against a specific pathogen, but also a reduction in the general function of the immune system, potentially resulting in reduced resistance to infectious diseases in general, and even a lower vigilance towards tumor cell development. However, relying on susceptibility to real-world infections as the outcome of study, the global efficacy of the immune function can be ultimately evaluated. So in this regard, preliminary evidence suggests that maternal prenatal PFAS exposure may increase the risk of offspring infections during childhood. While prenatal timing is important, early childhood actually represents the window in which the offspring interacts directly with the surrounding environment. And as I mentioned, the immune system begins to maturate. To date, there have been very few studies that evaluated childhood PFAS exposure in relation to common infectious diseases. Okay, moving on now to section 3, where we will present some data from our recent work. So therefore, in the following study, we aim to investigate for the first time whether childhood and adolescent PFAS exposure may lead to immunosuppressive outcomes in a nationally representative sample using NHANES data. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So a little bit more about this work. So the NHANES study, known as the National Health and Nutrition Examination Study, is a national survey that some of you may be familiar with. It measures the health and nutrition status in the United States every 2 years, and it involves questionnaire through interviews, physical examination, and specimen collection for environmental and other biomarker measurements. In this particular analysis, we included children between the ages of 3 and 19 and adolescents between the ages of 12 and 19 from the 2013 to 2014 cycle. And this accounts for about a third of the total number of children or adolescents in the cycle. This was the number for which we had PFAS measured in the serum. So moving on to the next slide. So we looked at, for our exposure, the serum concentrations of the following compounds. So PFOA, PFAS, perfluorohexane sulfonic acid, and perfluoronanonic acid, so PFNA. And the outcome that we looked at in NHANES was common cold obtained by the parent or the proxy for the child. And the question that the proxy or the parent had to answer was, did your child have a head cold or chest cold that started during the last 30 days or the last previous days? And we adjusted for covariates, including age, sex, race, and income poverty ratio. And this data was obtained from questionnaires. So I'm not going to go into too much of the statistical modeling that we use, but just to say that we use two different approaches. The first one, we used multivariable logistic regression models to estimate the odds ratios and the 95% confidence intervals for common cold per doubling of the individual PFAS biomarker concentration, adjusting for covariates. And this data was weighted by the NHANES sampling weights. We further investigated effect modification by sex to look at differences between boys and girls. Okay, next slide. I'm very impressed with Vicente. Good job switching over. In another method, we looked at what we consider complex mixtures. And to do this, we used Bayesian kernel machine regression models known as BKMR. And just briefly, this type of method allows us to assess the joint effect of PFAS mixtures on common cold. So rather than look at each individual congener PFAS at a time, like we did in the logistic regression, in this particular method, we were able to look at correlations, nonlinear associations, and interactions within the mixture. And we're also able to look at the individual dose-response relationship between each compound with common cold when holding all of the other mixture concentrations at their median. This method also allows us to look at the joint effect of the total mixture on common cold. So rather than looking at each individual chemical at a time, we can look at the totality of the mixture. And this represents more real-life scenarios of PFAS exposure. So briefly, our population here were children and adolescents. We had 517 children between the ages of 3 and 11. The mean age was 7. For adolescents, we had 394 adolescents between 12 and 19, and the mean age was 16. About 52% of these children were white, and 55% of the adolescents were white, and 14% of the children were non-Hispanic Black, and 15% equivalent for the adolescents. And the prevalence of common cold in the last month reported by parents was 23% for children and 17% for adolescents. So not a rare outcome, which gives us some support in terms of the power of the analysis. So moving on to the next slide. So here briefly is the biomarker distribution of these PFAS that we looked at, comparing young children to adolescents. There were some differences, with younger children showing higher concentrations of certain compounds such as PFOA and PFNA, and lower concentrations for children compared to adolescents for PFHX, sorry about that. I'm losing my train of thought. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so next slide. This is the result of the multivariate model. And here we can see the odds ratio for common cold for the doubling of biomarker concentrations. So the first column, we see children between the ages of 3 and 18. And we found that for perfluorohexane sulfonic acid, there was approximately a 30% increased odds of common cold for every doubling of perfluorohexane sulfonic acid. We also found similarly for children between 3 and 11 years of age, about a 36% increased odds of common cold for doubling of PFNA. So that's the first column. There was an increased odds of common cold in relation to these two particular PFAS congeners. For adolescents between 12 and 19, we found similarly that perfluorohexane sulfonic acid also increased the odds of common cold. And contrary to what we found in children, we found that PFNA might decrease the risk of, or decrease the odds of common cold among adolescents, but we cannot rule out the potential for confounding with that finding. So we're not sure how to interpret it per se without more investigation. So moving on to the next slide, looking at the differences between boys and girls. So when we dug a little bit deeper to look at the sex stratified analysis, so we divided the population into boys and girls, and we looked at whether or not there were differences between boys and girls with respect to the risk of, or the odds of, common cold. And what we found here, interestingly, was that PFHXS, the increased odds was really predominantly among boys and not girls. So this is the column here that's been highlighted. And we found the test for heterogeneity was positive. So that was a statistical difference between boys and girls, with boys showing an increased odds, whereas girls did not show an increased odds of common cold with respect to this congener. And with respect to PFNA, we found that there was potentially some differences as well, because the test for heterogeneity was positive, but we again cautioned the interpretation of this particular protective effect due to potential chance findings or confounding. Okay, so moving on to the BKMR model. Okay, this figure. So this figure shows the univariate dose response relationship between individual PFAS concentrations and common cold, holding all other PFAS concentrations at their median concentration. So when we look at the age group between 3 and 11 versus 12 and 19, the patterns were consistent with our multivariate associations for children, where we found positive associations for PFHXS and PFNA, which was slightly nonlinear in children. However, for adolescents, we found that PFOA showed a possible positive association, a strong negative association for PFNA. So if you look at the figures, you can't see my cursor, but maybe Vicente can show how the lines are increasing, especially for PFNA for the children 3 to 11. Yeah, right there, exactly. PFNA goes up across the increase of the concentration, as well as PFHXS also going up across concentrations for 3 to 11. So that's very consistent with what we found in our univariate models using logistic regression. And so we can move on to, I think, the next, which I think is really compelling. So this particular BKMR analysis shows the cumulative effect of the total PFAS concentration on common cold. So this looks at the change in common cold estimate for every 5th percentile increase or decrease from the median concentration of all PFAS biomarkers. So here in the age group 3 to 11, if Vicente can just put his cursor across, in the kids 3 to 11 years of age, we see an increasing trend of common cold across quantiles of the total PFAS mixture. And so if we look at the 50th percentile right in the middle, yeah, right there. And so we see that anything above the 50th percentile, the risk of common cold goes up linearly. So for every quantile increase, the risk or the estimate of common cold goes up. For adolescents 12 to 19, there's really no pattern. We see no pattern really. There's sort of more scattered results. But definitely this is consistent with our univariate analysis and our logistic regression analysis, showing that young children 3 to 11 appear to have a higher risk of common cold with regard to exposure to PFAS biomarkers. Okay. So in summary, we found robust associations for serum PFHXS concentrations and increased odds of common cold among children and adolescents. We found positive associations between serum PFNA concentrations and common cold in children, while a possible negative association among adolescents, but again, we caution that result. We also found a clear increasing trend of common cold estimate across quantiles of the concentration of the total PFAS mixture among children, but not among adolescents. Okay, so we're going to move on to our conclusion. So again, associations between PFAS and common cold were most robust among children or during childhood, 3 to 11-year-olds. Early childhood may be a critical period for PFAS-related immune effects compared to adolescence. And adolescent PFAS exposure may be more prone to confounding by dietary, personal care product use, and other exposure sources or behaviors, including smoking or alcohol. And so the ability for us to detect an effect of these compounds in adolescents seems to potentially be obscured by other factors. some of the strengths and limitations of our work. So some of the main strengths are that we use nationally representative sample, should say sample, not simple, I'm sorry for the typo, and that childhood window of exposure is really relevant and understudied. The long half-lives of PFAS counteracts the cross-sectional design of the NHANES study, making reverse causality less likely. And common cold could be considered a marker of general immune system function. And we also used a mixture methodology using BKMR to look at the totality of these 4 congeners on common cold effects. Some of the limitations include the lack of data on confounders such as breastfeeding and dietary intake like food or seafood consumption. The outcome, common cold, was self-reported by parents, and as well as our inability to account for potential effects of prenatal PFAS on NHANES participants. So we didn't really account for or adjust for any of the effects of prenatal exposure. This was exposure cross-sectionally measured in children with respect to the endpoint of common cold. And we investigated 4 of the most important PFAS. However, we do know that individuals are exposed to dozens of congeners that were not accounted for, that likely leads to an underestimation of this potential observed relationship that we found between common cold and these 2 congeners. Moving on to, I think, our last slide. Yep, so PFAS lessons learned. In our opinion, safety must be demonstrated before commercialization. This recent publication, 2018 by Philippe Grandjean, is relevant with respect to decision-making around environmental health and immunotoxicity of PFAS. I suggest individuals look at that if there's an interest. And more importantly, in terms of our conclusion, is that mixtures rather than isolated PFAS may lead to immunosuppressive effects and an increased susceptibility to common cold infections. The PFAS mixture effect was clearly evident in childhood, which represents one of the most critical windows of exposure for immune function. And although there is limited immunotoxicological data for PFNA and PFHXS, I really have a hard time with that, our results suggest that these perfluorinated compounds are not safer than PFOA and PFAS, and so replacement chemicals should really be scrutinized. In addition, our opinion, I think at least the opinion of my team, is that looking at regulating chemicals as a class is something that we're really trying to pursue in terms of regulatory policy and effects, because limiting our evidence is based on individual congeners, but our knowledge is that that a class-based approach might be safer in terms of regulating these compounds with respect to children's health. With that, I would like to acknowledge my team first and foremost, Vicente Mustelis, who's online to answer questions, very much an expert in this area, who helped produce these slides. Yu Zhang, my doctoral student, Yang Sun and Yixin Wang, who are my postdocs, who are amazing and very knowledgeable in PFAS studies. Stelios also, who's Stelios Vagios, who's my clinical research assistant. And I want to thank the NIEHS for their generous offer and award for an R01 to study preconception PFAS exposure in reproduction, and Antonia Califat from the Centers for Disease Control, as well as my colleagues at the Massachusetts General Hospital, who have been instrumental in helping us accumulate study participants over time. So with that, I will leave it at our thank you slide. If Vicente could just pass on to the last one. So thank you so much for listening. Please find us on the web. Email me if you have any questions or any follow-up with respect to this presentation and results.
Great. Well, thank you so much. That was a lot to absorb between both of these questions. And there's a ton of questions, so I can already tell we won't get to them all, but I'll do my best here. So let's see. Did you adjust your study looking at stay-at-home children versus those going to daycare, maybe?
Oh, that's such a great question. And unfortunately, we don't have that level of data for this. However, daycare children represent a high risk, potentially higher risk, vulnerable group. And looking at the daycare environment is something that is obviously an understudied population that requires further examination with respect to their exposures, because we do know that the environments are very different from home environments. It's a great question that we don't have an answer to at the present, unfortunately, especially with respect to, you know, things like asthma, infections, and how they respond in this environment, given their exposure, and whether or not they're mediated by different conditions in the home versus daycare environment. We're trying to get a study in daycare funded, is my point. We've not succeeded yet.
So do PFAS, PFOA concentrations display co-linearly? Does a child with more PFHXS in their blood tend to have more PFNA in their blood as well?
Well, that's a very nice question as well. Thank you for these thoughtful questions. So some of these chemicals are correlated within an individual because they share common sources. So that's a really great point. Others do not. It again depends on the source of exposure within an individual, but they tend to correlate within and across people and groups. So, but it really is congenitor specific.
Okay.
In person, yeah.
Let's see, what's another one here? Well, here's one that I had too, because you highlighted several times about seafood. Could you just go in a little more about the contribution of seafood versus other types of food, I guess? I don't know.
Sure. Vicente, would you like to answer that one, or I can? Vicente is quite knowledgeable on the nutrition end of things as well. Is Vicente still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, hi, yeah.
Yeah, so regarding food, fish and seafood is one of the most known predictors of PFAS exposure, but it is very, very difficult to isolate. And for example, in the EFSA report that Carmen mentioned in the talk, they identified fish, meat, fruit and fruit products, and eggs products as the dietary items that contributed most to the exposure. But since if a ground is contaminated, the food that is being collected there will also tend to accumulate PFAS. It is difficult to isolate sources, but there are some sources such as fish that and some meats that represent a clear source of exposure.
Yes, I agree with that. Those statements, very correct, because again, it's relating to bioaccumulation through chains of production, through contaminated soil, contaminated water, and how those fruits, vegetables, animals grow and feed. And that accumulates the concentration in the animal product into the human. And that's why we see food as being the #1 or primary source of exposure relative to other sources.
This is Angie. I would just add to this too that to direct everyone, I think FDA published a market basket study report. This may have been a couple of years ago now, that has lots of different types of meat, produce, dairy products on it with various PFAS concentrations that were measured. So that's a good resource to kind of get a sense of the concentrations of these PFAS chemicals in products.
So I want to, yeah, that's a great point and a great resource. I want to raise one particular point that I don't think I emphasized at all in the presentation, only because we don't have any data on it, but is critical in this particular context of the pandemic with COVID, that we do know that immunosuppression makes us more vulnerable to manifestations of things like SARS-CoV-2. So we see differences in how people respond to exposure to SARS-CoV-2. Some people get really sick, some people get less sick. And there's data and research that's being generated presently as we speak throughout the pandemic, looking at PFAS as a potential modifier in terms of how our bodies respond. And the reason for that is that we do know that these compounds are immunotoxic and immunosuppressive. And people, the hypothesis is that people with higher concentrations, children, adults, older adults with higher concentrations may have a different response to the exposure of the virus, may have a poorer response, more clinical manifestations of the disease as a result. And so this kind of work is presently being conducted, and this is why these questions and looking at both animal studies and epidemiological data, common cold is a proxy for other immune aspects. So it's a marker, a kind of a crude marker, but a crude marker of how your body responds to infection. I think it's an important sort of maybe a canary in the coal mine, in the sense of like, if we have more exposure to these congeners, we have more colds, but we could also have more of other things, and those other things haven't been looked at. Higher risk of these other kind of immune outcomes. Those other immune outcomes haven't necessarily been looked at, but are important. And this is just the beginning of this work. We're really at the infancy of this work in terms of understanding the immune effects of PFAS on especially children, adolescents, and with respect to pregnancy, which is something that I'm looking at, fertility and pregnancy outcomes as well. So more studies are really needed. And we need to focus beyond just PFOA and PFAS to really understand the complexity of this problem, because we know there's dozens of PFAS circulating in our environment, and we're really only touching the tip of the iceberg when we measure, these 4 congeners that we mentioned in our work. But there's dozens of others that we have no knowledge about, and they are impacting potentially our health in many different ways, including the ways that Dr. Perez mentioned through liver and reproductive, neurological, and thyroid-based endpoints.
Right. So you're bringing up some points. Our next webinar on March 2nd is talking a little bit more about PFAS and mixtures and research that's going on at Boston University. And we're on March 24th, we'll have a webinar that's focused on a class approach to PFAS. And so we'll talk a little bit more about those topics then. But there's lots of questions here, and I'm going to ask another one. Have you considered the possibility that inconsistent findings of PFAS on common cold in adolescents may reflect the impact of the onset of hormonal disturbances during adolescence?
That's something we haven't looked at least not in this work, but something that is of concern. Again, this work is really nascent. I don't know of any, Vicente, can you jog my memory if you know of any particular work looking at pubertal onset, pubertal duration, pubertal length of puberty, timing of puberty? I think that's the question, if I'm getting it correctly.
Yes, and those studies, there are some preliminary evidence that PFAS compounds can also affect the endocrine endpoints, including hormonal variations, but perhaps also the question is oriented towards that the adolescent group may be a heterogeneous group also in terms of the changes in hormones in both girls and boys that also have an impact on immune system, on metabolism. So I agree that while the child group is more homogeneous and maybe may constitute a critical window of exposure for immune system effects, the adolescent groups may have more variability in terms of dietary intake, in terms of behaviors, of smoking, of alcohol, of hormonal changes, and all of that, those factors can end up in a higher variability, and for us, in a more difficult way of studying this association between PFAS and immune system, or in this case, the risk of suffering from common colds or other infections.
Mm-hmm. We're also looking at NHANES and exploring other endpoints that we have not published yet that you can look out for in the next year at conferences and in upcoming papers, looking at novel endpoints, including bone density, thyroid function in children, adolescents, again, using NHANES data. And there's still much to be learned from the epidemiological work. And again, our knowledge is really just being formed around how these chemicals affect us. And I think the key message, however, is that we need more, we need more studies, but we also need more kind of a public health approach would be to regulate these chemicals on a class-based approach, if possible, with respect to vulnerable groups such as children and pregnant women, or women intending to become pregnant.
Okay, here's another question. So PFOA, PFAS levels in serum, in blood, have in the U.S. population have been decreasing over the past 2 decades because of the phase outs. So are you aware of data showing long-term trends of the cold and flu prevalence? And is there any correlations or anything that can be said about those levels going down?
Well, they've gone down in some congeners like PFAS and PFOA, but other congeners have gone up. And so the totality of the burden of exposure could remain generally steady over time. And we don't know how these other congeners play out with respect to these endpoints because they've not been studied. Common cold, the prevalence of common cold does not change over time per se. I mean, there's seasonal variation, there's annual variation, of course, there's some variation over time depending on what's circulating in the population, but those things are kind of at a steady state, and we can't really look at, that's more of an ecological study looking at the the level of concentration of these chemicals over a period of 10 years versus the change in common colds over 10 years. That's a real ecological based study, and I don't think it would add much value with respect to the questions that we're trying to answer, in my opinion.
I have one other, this is Angie again, I have one other comment about that too, because in that transition between prepubescent and pubescent, there potentially is, at least for females, a source of significant loss of at least for PFAS and PFOA, because another interesting finding is that menstrual blood loss accounts for a significantly shortened half-life, sometimes in excess of 30% in females versus males. So I think, and that's also been evidenced by the finding that older females, like post-menstruous females, have longer half-lives of those same PFAS chemicals. So I'm wondering if there is some sort of way to look at, like, this, because they're losing more PFOA, PFAS, during menses, is that also, would that impact their propensity to develop cold and flu? Or
that's kind of a nice way of looking at it. I mean, definitely, I don't know if this is, if the audience is aware, but you raise a really important point with regard to menstrual blood loss and the contribution it has to the body burden of these chemicals in serum. That's underappreciated, probably underknown even. And the question, I think, is what's relevant here is, with respect to maybe pubertal timing, is that, I don't know what the hypothesis would be if it decreases the age of first menses for a girl, or increases or decreases the age of first menses for a girl, but definitely post menses, once you have your first period, following that, your concentrations would go down. And so it's somehow adaptive to start menstruating earlier, if you will, in that sense, because it releases the body from the chemical. But whether or not that has an impact on adolescent cold and flu, I mean, that could contribute to some of our mixed findings, definitely with respect to adolescents, because we didn't really see a clear pattern. It wasn't consistent with the childhood. The childhood exposures were very consistent, and the contours, the effects, the total effect was of the chemical mixture was really obvious and clear. Where with adolescents, the picture was very murky. And I think these questions that you raised in terms of other variables that might impact potential outcomes in this adolescent age group could contribute to why we don't see a clear pattern. And maybe we did look at sex specific, but again, we didn't see much. It's not like we picked it up in boys only among the adolescents, which, I mean, I'm looking at slide number 23 again. I mean, well, Vicente, you can go to slide 23. I mean, if it's possible, I mean, we'll share these, but there was a 37% increased odds of, so girls had a higher, it wasn't significant, but had a higher odds of common cold among adolescent girls compared to boys. And that's for that specific congener, PFHXS. But that's a good question. I think we just need more longitudinal data on this to really answer it.
Okay, well, I think we didn't get to all the questions, but I think I picked out some of the most meaty ones, I hope. And I just want to really thank our presenters today. It is 3 o'clock, so I think we'll wrap up here. We do have a bunch more webinars, you know, and the information, if you haven't gotten it via an email, it's on the NMOA website. Showed you where you can get to all the archive of past things that NMOA has done. And these presentations will get posted on the NMOA website, and when they are, I will send an email out to everybody who was an attendee today. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Perez, Dr. Messerlian, and Dr. Mustiel. Sorry about that. Oh my goodness. This was really interesting. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Please be in touch by email for more questions. We're available by email also, anytime.
Yes, yes. The contact information is on the slides, and those will get posted, so you will have that. And everybody enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Vicente?